And I look back at some of those protests, like when we discovered that pubs and bars were refusing to serve people who identified as gay. We turned up, not just one or two, but 50 or 60 of us, and demanded to be served. One of the most famous examples was the Tatchell pub in West London, not far from where the GLF used to hold its weekly meetings. We went there one night in an organised posse after hearing that LGBT people had been refused service, and we demanded to be served. We were refused. They called the police. We had to sit down in the pub. Interestingly, it wasn't the local police that came. It was the flying squad, the really tough guys who deal with armed criminals. They were the ones who were sent to deal with the Gay Liberation Front. But we were quite undeterred, quite unfazed. They dragged us out and did all kinds of humiliating things. I was one of a group that was made to strip search in the little alleyway outside the pub. And I can remember a big burly sergeant, when he got me down to my underpants, then reached inside and gave my balls a great big hard squeeze of delight until I squealed. But of course in those days, the police would get away with such things, as indeed they did. But the pub did not get away with things that night. They soon got the message that if they didn't relent, we'd be back next week, the week after, the week after, the week after that. We only had to wait about 2 weeks before we got a message saying, gays and lesbians are welcome in the Tatchell pub. and soon it spread. The word spread amongst landlords and hoteliers all over West London and eventually Central London that don't mess with those GLF people, you know. And soon we found that the number of pubs and bars and indeed restaurants refusing to serve LGBT people dramatically declined pretty much overnight. Sorry? 1971. 1971. The other interesting thing about the Gay Liberation Front is that it never argued for equality. I can never ever remember the word equality ever passing our lips, or ever being a slogan, or ever being on any banner. Our agenda was about changing society, not conforming to it. We didn't want to fit in with the way straights did things. We wanted to change things for the benefit of queers and straights. So we had a whole new agenda about everything, about the family, about gender roles. You know, I look back in those days and I think, you know, what happened to all these incredibly exciting ideas? You know, the Gay Liberation Front, one of its key ideas was that gender roles, the traditional way that men and women are supposed to behave, which is a hand-me-down from patriarchal society, that this is a key element of both women's oppression and gay oppression. That forcing or expecting women or men to conform to these gender roles, for men to behave in a masculine way, for women to behave in a feminine way, that was a key ideology that underpinned the oppression of women and LGBT people. You know, obviously, gay men do not conform to the traditional male expectation about how men are supposed to behave. You know, you're supposed to screw women, not other men. Moreover, because it's true that, on average, generally, gay and bisexual men tend to be more gender variant, you know, not always the same kind of macho image and behaviour as traditional straight men. You know, we do diverge from the norm. And that's a good thing, because our agenda is all about everybody having the right to be who you want to be yourself, be true to thyself. The same with lesbian women. They didn't, in many cases, in most cases perhaps, didn't fit the traditional feminine ideal, the traditional expectation of what women were, how they looked, how they behaved. I think back at all those lesbian women from GLF and since, who've pioneered women's advancement into traditionally all-male occupations. You know, plumbers, bus drivers, electricians, you know, Much of that work was done and pioneered by women who refused to conform to a particular idea about how women are supposed to be. So to me, that whole lesson about gender variance, about gender subversion, is really, really important. Because if you don't make that part of your agenda, then of course any woman, in fact, queer or straight, who doesn't conform to the feminine ideal, will find discrimination, prejudice, bullying, taunts, and so on, and the same with any man who doesn't conform to the masculine ideal. There was, of course, a great split within the Gay Liberation Front between those who argued that first we had to change ourselves before we thought about changing society, and indeed some who thought that changing ourselves would change society. So there's a whole section of the Gay Liberation Front who put lifestyle changes and personal changes at the core of the political process for change. They thought it was very important that men dressed in drag or elements of drag to challenge machismo and to challenge traditional masculine ideals. And so I can remember, putting on an earring, a bit of lipstick, getting into more feminine clothes and prancing around in the street in public, just to show that I wasn't afraid of being a gender variant man, that I wasn't afraid of not conforming to the traditional masculine ideal. And so did many of the lesbian women. They butched up in king drag. The idea was to try and just subvert the traditions, turn them on their head.